Years ago, I attended high school in Chicago, a typical public school on the outskirts of the city. Not the worst area, but not the best either. It was an old brick building, a bit worn down but functional. You know the type. Creaky floors, dim hallways, that weird smell that's a mix of old books and musty air. I was a junior then, just trying to survive the endless pile of exams, group projects, and whatever else the school threw our way. I didn't hang out much after school. I wasn't really into the social scene. I had a small group of friends, and we mostly kept to ourselves. But one thing I loved was sitting by the windows in class, especially during spring. There's just something calming about watching people walk outside or seeing the trees swaying in the breeze while you're stuck inside. That particular semester, I had an English class right after lunch on the 3rd floor. The classroom was pretty standard. Rows of desks, a chalkboard that hadn't been updated since forever. And the best part, huge windows that let in a lot of light. It overlooked the courtyard and the street beyond. The view wasn't anything special. Just a few trees, the fence, and some houses in the distance. But it was a break from staring at my textbooks all day. One week, something strange started happening. It was around the beginning of April, I think. I was sitting at my usual desk by the window, minding my own business, flipping through some notes before class started. The bell hadn't rung yet, so people were still trickling in, talking and joking around. As I glanced outside, I noticed someone standing across the street. At first, I didn't think much of it. There were always people walking by, parents picking up their kids, random passers-by, whatever. But this person wasn't moving. They were just standing there, facing the school, not doing anything. Just staring. I couldn't make out their face clearly because they were standing in the shade of a tree. But I could tell it was a man, based on the build, wearing a long coat or jacket. Even though I couldn't see his face, something about the way he stood there felt off. Like he was deliberately trying to avoid being seen too clearly. I shook it off at first. I figured maybe he was waiting for someone or something. I mean, it's a school. People wait outside all the time. But then I saw him again the next day, same spot, same time, just standing there. I remember staring at him, waiting for him to move or do something. But he just stood there, facing the building, not even shifting from one foot to the other. It was weird, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Maybe I was just being paranoid. So I didn't tell anyone. The 3rd day, though, I started feeling a little more uneasy. I kept catching glimpses of him, and every time I looked, he was in the exact same spot, not moving. My mind started to go through all the possibilities. Maybe he was a parent waiting for their kid, or maybe he was some sort of maintenance worker. But none of that made sense. Why would someone be standing there day after day, not doing anything? I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. By the end of the week, I was seriously creeped out. I kept looking over my shoulder, glancing out the window whenever I had the chance. But on Friday, something changed. He wasn't there in the morning. I scanned the street before class and didn't see him, which felt like a huge relief. Maybe whoever it was had finally moved on. But halfway through the period, I heard a loud crash. It was so sudden that it took a second to register what had happened. The entire classroom went silent. Then there was this sharp, ringing sound, like glass scattering everywhere. I looked over, and the window next to my desk was shattered. Glass was everywhere, on my desk, on the floor, even in my hair. Everyone in the room jumped up. Some people screamed. I just sat there, frozen for a second, trying to process what had just happened. The teacher rushed over, asking if I was okay. I wasn't hurt, just shaken up. But what really freaked me out was the fact that I hadn't touched the window. No one had. There hadn't been any loud noises or signs that something was wrong before it shattered. It just happened. The school called maintenance, and they cleaned up the mess, but no one could figure out what caused the window to break. No birds, no rocks, nothing. It was like it just exploded on its own. For the rest of the day, I couldn't concentrate. All I could think about was the man I'd seen standing outside, the one who had been there all week. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow it was connected, though I had no real reason to believe that. But still, it felt like too much of a coincidence. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept picturing that broken window and the man outside. The next morning, I woke up feeling even worse. I was on edge, paranoid about everything. I didn't even want to go to school, but I had an exam, so I forced myself to get ready and head out. When I got to class, I immediately glanced out the window. To my relief, the man wasn't there. It was almost enough to make me think I'd been overreacting the whole time. But that sense of relief didn't last long. During the exam, I kept feeling this weird pressure, like someone was watching me. I know it sounds cliché, but it's the only way I can describe it. Every time I looked up from my paper, I felt the urge to glance at the window, but I forced myself not to. I told myself I was just being ridiculous, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me after the window incident. I powered through the exam, trying to focus on the questions in front of me. But then I heard something. It was faint, barely audible at first, like a soft tapping sound. I figured it was just someone tapping their pen or something, but it didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. I looked around the room, but no one else seemed to notice it. I started to feel this growing sense of dread, like something was seriously wrong. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I glanced over at the window and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing just outside, was the man. He was closer this time, right by the fence that bordered the schoolyard. I still couldn't make out his face, but I could tell he was looking straight at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to say something, to call the teacher over, but my throat felt tight. I just sat there, frozen in my seat, staring at him. After what felt like an eternity, the bell rang, snapping me out of my trance. The man was gone. I don't know when he left or how, but by the time I looked back at the window, he wasn't there anymore. I grabbed my stuff and practically ran out of the classroom, not caring if anyone saw me. I needed to get out of there. For the rest of the day, I avoided the windows as much as possible. I even considered skipping school altogether, but I didn't want to get in trouble. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. The following Monday, I decided to switch seats in class. I couldn't sit by the window anymore. I told my teacher I needed a change of scenery, and she didn't question it. I ended up sitting closer to the middle of the room, far from the windows. But even then, I couldn't fully relax. Every time I walked past a window, I felt a jolt of anxiety, like I was going to see him again. I started taking different routes home, just in case. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not even my friends. I didn't want them to think I was losing it. But I did notice a change in my behavior. I became more paranoid, more jumpy. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, checking to make sure no one was following me. Things went back to normal for a while. I didn't see the man again, and the window incident was eventually forgotten by most people. But I couldn't forget. It was always in the back of my mind, that feeling that something had been watching me, something I couldn't explain. About a month later, I transferred to a different school. My parents were planning to move for a while, and it just made sense for me to switch before senior year started. I didn't tell them about the window or the man. I didn't tell anyone. It felt too weird, too unbelievable. But every now and then, I'll think back to that time and I wonder if it was all just in my head. Maybe the window was just a freak accident. Maybe the man was just some random person with nothing better to do. But deep down, I don't think I'll ever really know. This happened to me a few years ago when I was still in high school in Los Angeles. It was nothing fancy, just your standard public high school in the Valley. I was a junior, and back then, sports were a big part of my life. I played volleyball, and most of my afternoons after school were spent in practice or conditioning. So I was often one of the last people to leave the building. Our school had a big old gym, and behind it, there was a girls' locker room that was just as old. It wasn't like one of those modern, updated locker rooms with nice benches and plenty of space. This one was cramped, dingy, and always kind of had a weird smell to it. The lockers were these old metal ones that were a pain to open if they ever got stuck, and the showers looked like they hadn't been renovated since the 80s. Still, it was just where we changed after practices, so I never thought much of it. One day after practice, it was around 6 p.m., and most of the team had already gone home. It wasn't unusual for a few of us to linger behind, chatting while we changed. We didn't think much of it, especially since the coach was always somewhere around the building or the gym staff were usually cleaning up. It felt safe enough, even if the place could get a little eerie with the bad lighting and old squeaky doors. There were about 5 of us left that day. We'd just finished changing out of our practice uniforms and were about to head out. The locker room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the old lights flickering above us. I was sitting on the bench, tying my shoes when I heard it. This soft knock, almost like someone gently tapping on the locker room door. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe one of the gym staff had locked themselves out or something. But the door was supposed to be locked from the inside. The knock wasn't loud, and no one really reacted, so I kept doing my thing. But then it happened again. A little louder this time, but still soft, like someone testing to see if we'd notice. I looked up, but no one else seemed concerned. I was halfway done with my shoes when I heard the door handle jiggle. Now that got my attention. The door wasn't supposed to open from the outside unless you had a key. One of the girls asked if we'd heard it too, and we all kind of nodded. We didn't say anything out loud, but there was this unspoken tension in the room. It wasn't that late, but the gym was always pretty empty by that time of day, so we were definitely alone, or at least we thought we were. The door rattled again, this time more violently, like someone was trying to force it open. We all just froze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I think all of us were on edge now. We didn't know who it was, and there were no windows in the locker room, so we couldn't see anything outside. Just this old wooden door with its rusty handle shaking like someone was desperate to get in. For a second, I thought maybe it was the coach. But why wouldn't she just call out or unlock the door herself? She had keys. The rattling stopped for a moment, and we just sat there in silence, waiting for something to happen. It was dead quiet, and I could hear the heavy breathing of the girl next to me. I felt my own breath coming faster, too. Suddenly, there was this loud thud, like someone had kicked the door or slammed into it. We all jumped, and one of the girls let out this half-whispered yelp. Whoever was on the other side wasn't just messing around anymore. They were trying to get in, and it was aggressive now. The handle was shaking so hard that I thought it might actually break. One of the girls suggested we call the coach, but none of us had our phones on us at the time. Stupid, I know, but we usually left them in our bags during practice. And the bags were in the lockers on the other side of the room, which suddenly felt a lot farther away than they really were. None of us wanted to move. We were all too scared to even stand up, let alone go grab a phone. The door rattled again, this time with even more force, like someone was practically hanging off the handle. Then it stopped. Just like that, no more noises, no more knocks, nothing. We all just sat there, staring at the door, waiting. The silence was almost worse than the rattling. It stretched on for what felt like forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, one of the girls, Jenna, got up the courage to move. She stood up, tiptoed over to her locker, and grabbed her phone. She called the coach, her voice trembling as she told her what was going on. The rest of us just stood there, clutching our bags, trying not to freak out. The coach said she'd be there in a minute, and we all waited, staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any second. But nothing happened. We heard the gym doors open a few minutes later, and then the coach was there, knocking on the locker room door from the outside. We all rushed to let her in, explaining what had happened. She looked concerned, but when she opened the door, there was no one there. The hallway outside the locker room was completely empty. She checked the security cameras, but they didn't show anything unusual. The only thing we saw was the janitor walking by earlier. But he hadn't come anywhere near the locker room at the time we heard the knocking and rattling. It didn't make sense. Whoever had been trying to get in was gone, like they'd just vanished. We all left together that night, sticking close to the coach until we got to our cars or buses. I remember feeling so relieved to be outside in the open air where there were people around and streetlights and noise. But something about the whole thing just didn't sit right with me. It wasn't like anyone had actually seen who was trying to get in, and that made it worse somehow. It felt like we were being messed with, but by who? And why? Over the next few days, things went back to normal. We had practice, we changed in the locker room, and no one really brought up what happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I walked into that locker room, I felt this pit in my stomach, like something wasn't right. I didn't want to change alone, so I started sticking closer to the other girls, not saying anything, just making sure I wasn't the last one to leave. A week or so later, I was sitting in my history class when the school made an announcement. They didn't say much, just that we were supposed to avoid certain parts of the gym for a few days because of maintenance issues. No one thought much of it, but I knew something was up. I overheard some of the teachers whispering in the hallway about it, and my curiosity got the better of me. I asked one of the girls on the basketball team if she knew anything, and she told me that there had been a break-in at the school after hours. Nothing had been stolen, but someone had forced their way into the gym, and the administration didn't want anyone to panic. I felt this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. Was it connected to what had happened in the locker room? I couldn't be sure, but the timing was too close to just be a coincidence. I didn't tell anyone about it, though. What was I supposed to say? That I thought some random person had tried to break into the locker room, and now they were breaking into the school at night? It sounded ridiculous even to me, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I started avoiding the locker room as much as I could, changing quickly and leaving as soon as practice was over. Some of the other girls noticed and started doing the same. No one really said anything about it, but you could tell we were all a little more on edge, a little quicker to leave when practice was done. Things didn't get any better. A few weeks later, there was another incident. This time it wasn't in the locker room, but in the gym itself. One of the girls on the basketball team said she'd stayed late after practice to shoot some free throws. It was around 7 p.m., and the gym was supposed to be locked up soon, but the coach had given her permission to stay for a bit longer. She was alone, or at least she thought she was. She said she kept hearing these weird noises, like footsteps, but every time she turned around, no one was there. She brushed it off at first, thinking maybe it was just the old building making noises. But then she heard something louder, like someone running down the bleachers. She said she looked up and saw a shadow moving near the back of the gym. But when she went to check, there was no one there. She left in a hurry after that, and when she told the coach, they checked the security cameras again. Same thing. Nothing on the footage, just an empty gym. Except for her. That's when the rumors started. People began talking about how someone had been trying to break into the school at night, but no one could figure out who it was or why. It wasn't like they were stealing anything, just trying to get in. The administration kept it quiet, but it was hard not to notice when extra locks were added to some of the doors. And they started keeping the gym lights on longer at night. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. The break-ins eventually stopped, or at least no one heard about them anymore. But I never felt comfortable in that locker room again. Even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes. It's not like anything terrible happened, but there's something deeply unsettling about knowing that someone was out there trying to get in. And the fact that they never got caught just makes it worse. This was back in my senior year of high school in San Diego. I went to a fairly normal school, nothing fancy, just a big old building that had been around for decades. It was the kind of place where the paint on the walls was starting to peel, and the hallways had this stale, musty smell no matter how many times they tried to air it out. Typical old school vibes. Anyway, I was staying late one evening to finish up a project. I think it was for my art class, something I'd been putting off until the last minute like I always did. It wasn't that unusual for me to stay after school. A few other kids would sometimes hang around for extracurriculars or to get help from a teacher, so I didn't think much of it. By the time I was done, though, most of the school had cleared out. It was that weird time of day where everything starts to feel kind of eerie because the place is so empty. But there's still enough light outside to remind you that it's not quite nighttime yet. I packed up my stuff, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and headed for my locker to grab the rest of my things. The halls were dead silent, and you could hear every little sound like my footsteps echoing against the tile floor. It was around 5:30 p.m., and the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting these long shadows through the windows. You know that time of day where it's not dark yet, but it feels like the light is sort of fading into this dull, orangey gray. That's what it was like. I wasn't in a hurry or anything, just moving along, lost in my thoughts about the project. As I walked down the hallway toward my locker, I noticed someone further down at the end of the corridor. It was the custodian. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing there with his mop bucket. He waved at me when he saw me, but it was more like a casual acknowledgement than a friendly greeting. I waved back, even though something about it felt a little off. It was one of those moments where you don't really think much about it at the time, but later it sticks with you. I didn't really know the guy. I'd seen him around, of course. He'd been working at the school for as long as I could remember. He was probably in his 50s, balding with these thick glasses that made his eyes look huge. He was always around cleaning up after everyone, usually keeping to himself. I'd never spoken to him beyond the occasional hi or thanks when he held the door open or something. I didn't have a reason to be creeped out by him, but there was something about the way he was standing there that made me feel uneasy. I brushed it off, though. After all, it was just the custodian doing his job, right? I reached my locker and started spinning the combination lock. That's when I noticed him again, standing at the end of the hall, just watching me. He hadn't moved, hadn't started cleaning, just stood there staring. I don't know why, but this time I felt a little more uncomfortable. The hallway was completely silent, and it was just the two of us in this long, empty stretch of the school. I tried to focus on getting my locker open, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably just a coincidence that he was still standing there. Once I grabbed my stuff, I slammed the locker shut, maybe a little too hard, just wanting to get out of there. I glanced down the hall again, and that's when I realized he was still standing there, still watching me, not moving an inch. I nodded awkwardly, trying to play it cool, but inside I was starting to feel anxious. My mind was racing with questions. Why hadn't he started cleaning yet? Why was he just standing there? I decided to get out of there as fast as possible without making it obvious that I was freaked out. I started walking toward the exit, trying to keep my pace normal, but I could feel my heart starting to race. As I got closer to the door, I turned back one last time. He was still standing there, still staring at me. But now he was at the very end of the hallway, almost blending into the shadows. I stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting me like a splash of water, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The parking lot was mostly empty, with just a few cars left, probably belonging to the staff who were still inside. I could see my car across the lot, and I hurried toward it, trying not to look back at the school. I just wanted to get home. The next morning, I didn't think much of it. I chalked it up to me being tired and maybe a little paranoid from staying at school late. I mean, it wasn't the first time I'd stayed late to work on something, and I'd never had any problems before. Besides, the custodian was just doing his job, right? I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. When I got to school, everything was normal. The day went by as usual, classes, lunch, more classes. It wasn't until later that afternoon during lunch that something weird happened. I was sitting with my friends, talking about whatever nonsense high school kids talk about, when I overheard a conversation at the table next to ours. One of the girls was saying something about the custodian quitting. I perked up at that, not because I cared much about the guy, but because it was a weird coincidence. I leaned over and asked them what they were talking about. Apparently the custodian had quit a few weeks ago. I don't know why I hadn't noticed before. Maybe because there were usually a couple of different custodians working in the building, and I didn't really pay attention to them. But this girl was saying how one of the teachers had mentioned it in class, that the guy had just left out of the blue, no explanation or anything. My stomach dropped. If he had quit weeks ago, then who the hell had I seen last night? My mind was racing, trying to piece it together. I knew what I saw. I had waved at him. He had waved back. But now people were saying he hadn't even been working there for weeks. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I figured maybe I had mixed up my dates, or maybe there was another custodian who looked like him. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I'd seen that guy around for years, and there was no mistaking him. The whole thing started to get to me. I didn't stay late after school anymore unless I absolutely had to. If I did, I made sure to leave before the halls got too empty. It wasn't like I thought anything would happen, but the whole situation left me feeling uneasy. I kept thinking about that moment in the hallway, the way he had just stood there, watching me. It didn't make sense. If he wasn't supposed to be there, what was he doing, and why didn't I hear anything about it afterward? There were no announcements, no emails, nothing. It was like the guy had just disappeared and no one cared. A few weeks went by, and I tried to put it out of my mind. But I still caught myself looking around the school, half expecting to see him again. It became this weird, constant, low-level anxiety. Every time I walked past a janitor's closet or heard someone wheeling one of those cleaning carts down the hall, I'd feel my pulse quicken. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. Then, one afternoon, I stayed late again, this time to work on something for my history class. It was close to 6 p.m. when I finished up, and the school was mostly empty, just like that other time. I tried to leave quickly, but as I was walking down the hall toward the exit, I heard something behind me. It was faint, like footsteps, but they were out of sync with mine. I stopped, and the sound stopped. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. I picked up the pace, my heart starting to race. I wasn't far from the exit now, but the building felt bigger, the hallways longer than they should have been. I could hear the sound again, the faint shuffle of footsteps, this time closer. I didn't look back. I just kept walking. When I finally made it to the door and stepped outside, I practically ran to my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys trying to unlock the door. I got in, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my breathing heavy. I sat there for a few minutes, just staring at the school building, half expecting to see someone come out, but no one did. The place was dead quiet. I don't know if I was imagining things or if something was really off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whole drive home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror like I was expecting to see someone following me. When I finally got home, I didn't say anything to my parents. They would have just told me I was overthinking it, or maybe that I was spending too much time at school. But I knew what I felt. Something had been there. After that, I stopped staying late. I finished my projects during class or brought them home to work on. I avoided being at the school when it was empty, especially in those dim, quiet hours when most people had already left. The custodian never showed up again, and no one ever mentioned him. It was like he had just been erased from the school's memory. A few years ago, something happened to me and my friends that I still think about a lot. I don't know how to explain it all or why it happened, but I can say for sure that it's the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. It was back when we were in high school in a small town called Grants Pass, Oregon. It's a pretty quiet place surrounded by forests, and most of the kids at my school grew up spending time outdoors, camping, hiking, fishing, that sort of thing. So when it came to shortcuts through the woods or walking home along the trails, no one really thought twice about it. It was just normal. There was this trail a bunch of us used that cut through the woods behind the school. It wasn't an official path or anything, just something students had made over the years by walking the same route every day. It saved us a solid 15 minutes off the walk home if you lived on the other side of town. The trail ran through a thick patch of trees and brush, crossing over a creek and coming out near some back roads. It wasn't particularly well known to adults, but for us it was like this little secret escape route. I wasn't someone who used it every day, but whenever I was in a rush or just felt like taking the scenic route, I'd take the shortcut with my friends. It was usually me, Jake, Sam, and Kayla, 4 of us who lived close to each other on the other side of the woods. We'd talk about school or joke around while walking home, like it was no big deal. There was one guy in our class, Chris, who used the trail every single day. He lived in a small house just past the woods, so it made sense for him to take the path. He'd walk it in the morning on the way to school and then again in the afternoon when he headed home. Chris wasn't exactly popular, but he wasn't an outcast either. He mostly kept to himself except for hanging out with a couple of other kids who were into gaming or skateboarding. I didn't know him super well, but we'd talk sometimes when we passed him on the trail. It was spring and things were pretty normal at first. We'd walk home like usual, taking the shortcut through the woods without really thinking about it. I mean, why would we? The worst thing that ever happened on that trail was the occasional sprained ankle or someone tripping over a root. It was just part of our routine. One Monday, though, everything changed. We were at school, sitting in class, and I noticed Chris wasn't there. I didn't think much of it. People miss school all the time. Maybe he was sick or something. But by the end of the day, people started talking. Chris hadn't shown up to any of his classes, and apparently no one had seen him since the previous Friday. His friends hadn't heard from him, and even the teachers seemed a little concerned. The next day came, and he still wasn't there. That's when things started to feel a little weird. The rumors began swirling around. People saying he'd run away or that he was in trouble with the police. I didn't believe any of it, but it was strange. Chris wasn't the type to skip school. He was quiet, sure, but responsible. It just didn't make sense for him to disappear without telling anyone. By Wednesday, everyone was talking about it. His parents had called the school and the police had been to his house, but no one knew where he was. People started saying they'd seen him walking through the woods on Friday afternoon, heading home like usual, but after that, nothing. It was like he'd vanished. That afternoon, as usual, we took the shortcut home. It was the same group, me, Jake, Sam, and Kayla, and we couldn't help but talk about Chris. The trail had never seemed creepy before, but after hearing all the rumors and the fact that no one knew what happened to him, walking through those woods felt different. The trees were taller, the shadows longer, and every little sound made me glance over my shoulder. We were all trying to act normal, joking around like usual, but it wasn't the same. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake. We reached the end of the trail and parted ways, but for the first time, I didn't feel relieved to be home. Something was wrong, even if we didn't know what it was yet. On Friday, the police came to the school. They were interviewing people, asking if anyone had seen Chris or knew where he might be. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. This was Grants Pass. Nothing like this ever happened here. People didn't just disappear. That afternoon, we took the trail again, but this time it was just me, Jake, and Sam. Kayla had gone home early, so it was just the three of us. As we walked, we kept talking about Chris, trying to figure out what could have happened. Sam suggested maybe he'd gotten lost or hurt in the woods. It wasn't a huge forest, but there were parts that were pretty dense, and it'd be easy to get turned around if you wandered off the trail. I didn't want to admit it, but the thought crossed my mind too. What if Chris had fallen, hit his head, and was still out there waiting for someone to find him? Halfway through the walk, something caught Jake's eye. There, off to the side of the path, was a backpack. It was old and dirty, like it had been sitting there for a while, but it was unmistakable. It was Chris's backpack. I recognized it right away because he always had that same faded blue bag with the frayed straps. We all just stopped in our tracks staring at it. No one said anything for a minute. I don't know why, but seeing his backpack sitting there abandoned sent a chill down my spine. Sam was the first to move. He walked over and picked it up, checking to see if there was anything inside. There wasn't much. Just a few notebooks, a water bottle, and some old wrappers. But that didn't matter. The fact that his backpack was there in the middle of the woods with no sign of him anywhere was enough to send us all into a panic. We didn't say much after that. We just grabbed the bag and practically sprinted out of the woods. We handed it over to the police when we got to town, telling them where we'd found it. They asked us a bunch of questions. If we'd seen anything unusual, if we'd noticed anyone else on the trail. But we hadn't. It was just us, like always. The next day, the police started searching the woods. They brought in dogs and a whole team to comb through the area, but as far as I know, They didn't find anything. Chris was just gone. The search went on for days, maybe even weeks, but eventually it started to die down. People stopped talking about it as much, and life at school went back to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after something like that. His parents were devastated, but the police couldn't give them any answers. It was like Chris had disappeared into thin air. We stopped taking the shortcut after that. None of us wanted to go back into the woods, not after what we found. I tried to push it out of my mind, to move on, but it wasn't that easy. Every time I passed by the edge of the woods, I'd get this sick feeling in my stomach, like something was wrong in there. I couldn't stop thinking about how his backpack ended up on the side of the trail and what might have happened to him after he left school that day. I didn't go back into those woods until the summer. It was a few months after Chris had gone missing, and things had mostly quieted down. The police had stopped searching and people had moved on. But I couldn't. I kept thinking about him, about his backpack sitting there, and I felt like I needed to do something. So one afternoon I decided to go back to the trail. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but I had to try. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, and I went alone. In hindsight, that was probably a dumb decision, but at the time, I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted answers. The woods were quiet, like always. But now that silence felt suffocating. Every step I took seemed louder, and the trees loomed over me, blocking out the sunlight. I followed the trail to where we'd found Chris's backpack, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got there, I stopped. The ground was covered in leaves and dirt like no one had been there in months. I stood there for a while, just staring at the spot, trying to figure out what could have happened. But there was nothing. No clues, no signs, nothing. Just the same empty woods I'd walked through 100 times before. I turned around and started to head back, feeling defeated. But as I was walking, I noticed something. There was a small clearing off to the side of the trail. A place I'd never really paid attention to before. It was hidden by the trees, but now that I was looking for it, I could see it clearly. The ground was uneven, like it had been disturbed, and there was something about it that felt wrong. I walked over to the clearing, my stomach in knots. The ground was soft, like it had been dug up and then covered again. I don't know what I was thinking, but I crouched down and started digging. At first it was just dirt and leaves, but then I hit something hard. My heart was racing as I brushed the dirt away, revealing a wooden plank buried in the ground. It looked like part of an old trap door or something. I pulled at the plank and it came loose with a groan. Beneath it was a hole, a deep, dark pit that seemed to stretch down into the earth. I couldn't see the bottom, but the air coming from it was cold, like it had been trapped down there for years. I stood there, staring into the darkness, my mind racing with questions. What the hell was this? Why was it here? I wanted to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't move. Something about that hole terrified me, but at the same time, I couldn't look away. I had this horrible feeling that whatever happened to Chris, it had something to do with this. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally snapped out of it and ran back to town. I didn't tell anyone what I found. I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? That I found a hole in the woods and thought it had something to do with Chris's disappearance? No one would believe me. But I believe it. I know what I saw. And I still wonder if Chris is down there, if he ever left those woods at all. I don't go near the trail anymore, and I don't talk about it with anyone, but I can't stop thinking about that pit and what might be inside. I don't know if I'll ever find out, but part of me hopes I never do. I went to a pretty average high school. Nothing special. It was one of those older schools with a bunch of add-ons that didn't really match the original building. You could tell they'd tried to modernize it, but it still had that run-down, outdated vibe. Anyway, one thing that stuck out was the elevator. Our school was pretty big, 3 floors, but only had this one small, slow elevator that was mostly used by teachers or students who had an injury or something. Most of us didn't really mess with it because it was always breaking down, and half the time it smelled weird. It was just this old metal box, and it creaked every time you stepped inside. So this happened on a Friday during my junior year. It was a long day already. I'd had a couple of exams that week, and I was exhausted. My last class was on the 3rd floor, and it was one of those classes that just dragged on forever. I remember feeling relieved when the bell finally rang, marking the end of the day. My friend group, there were 5 of us, had this thing where we'd meet up and hang out after school for a bit, usually near the cafeteria before heading home. That day, one of my friends, Megan, was on crutches. She'd twisted her ankle at soccer practice earlier in the week, so we'd been taking the elevator with her between classes. It wasn't a big deal. The elevator was slow, but it beat watching her struggle up and down the stairs. Since the rest of us were on the 3rd floor after the last bell, we all decided to take the elevator down together so Megan wouldn't have to go alone. It was me, Megan, Eric, Tara, and Jason. We all crammed into the elevator like usual. I remember Eric making some dumb joke about how the elevator probably couldn't hold all of us, but we were all tired, so no one really laughed. Megan hit the button for the 1st floor, and the doors closed with that slow, metallic sound. At first, everything was normal. The elevator lurched a bit as it started moving down, which wasn't unusual for that piece of junk. We were all just standing there, not talking much, when the elevator suddenly jolted. It wasn't a huge jolt, but enough to make us all grab onto the rail. Then it stopped. Just stopped. We were somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd floors, and the elevator had completely frozen. We stood there for a second, kind of waiting for it to start moving again, but nothing happened. Tara hit the button for the 1st floor again, but the elevator didn't budge. Eric was the first one to say something, joking about how we'd probably be stuck there all weekend. But the rest of us weren't really in the mood to laugh. The longer we stood there, the more we realized this wasn't just the usual slow elevator. We were actually stuck. Megan hit the emergency button, but all it did was make this faint buzzing noise that echoed through the elevator. We tried calling out, but it was a Friday afternoon and the building was already clearing out. Most of the teachers had probably already left, and the students were long gone. It was like no one even knew we were still in the school. We figured someone would come by soon and notice that the elevator wasn't working, maybe a teacher or one of the janitors. I tried to keep my cool, thinking it couldn't take that long for someone to realize we were stuck, right? But the minutes started ticking by, and nothing happened. I don't know how long we stood there at first, just waiting. It must have been at least 15 or 20 minutes. Eric kept pushing buttons. Tara was pacing as much as she could in that tiny space, and Megan was leaning against the wall, trying to stay off her injured foot. The air in the elevator was already feeling stale, and it was starting to get hot. You wouldn't think it would get that stuffy that quickly, but with 5 people in a confined space like that, it felt like we were suffocating. We tried yelling again, banging on the walls and the door, hoping someone would hear us. But the school was dead silent. After what felt like forever, Jason pulled out his phone only to realize he had no signal. None of us did. It was like we were trapped in some kind of metal box with no way to reach the outside world. That's when things started to get a little tense. Megan was trying to stay calm, but I could tell her ankle was hurting, and she was starting to panic a bit. Eric and Tara were arguing about whether we should keep trying to hit the buttons or if we should just wait for someone to find us. Jason wasn't saying much, just standing there with this blank look on his face. I think he was trying to keep himself from freaking out. After about half an hour, the realization hit us that no one was coming anytime soon. It was already after school, and most of the staff would have left by now. The thought that we might be stuck there for hours started to creep in. I kept thinking about all the times I'd seen that elevator break down before, how it sometimes took the school days to get it fixed. The idea of being trapped in there for hours, maybe overnight, was starting to feel more and more real. At some point, I lost track of time. The light in the elevator was this dull, yellowish color, flickering slightly, making the whole thing feel even more claustrophobic. The air was getting thicker, and I could feel sweat dripping down my back. Everyone was getting more irritable. Eric and Tara kept snapping at each other, and Megan looked like she was on the verge of tears. Jason just stared at the wall, like he was trying to mentally escape the situation. We all tried to sit down at some point, just to make ourselves more comfortable. But the floor of that elevator was dirty and grimy. I remember thinking about how much I wanted to be anywhere but there. How badly I wished we'd just taken the stairs. We were crammed into that small space, barely able to move, and the longer we stayed there, the more suffocating it felt. At some point, we heard a noise, a faint sound like footsteps echoing through the school. We all jumped up thinking someone was finally coming to help us. We started yelling, banging on the door again, hoping whoever it was would hear us. But the sound faded and we were left in silence again. It was crushing. That brief moment of hope only to be met with nothing. It made everything feel even worse. Hours passed. It felt like we'd been in that elevator for an eternity. My head was pounding from the heat and the stale air. Everyone was on edge, barely speaking to each other anymore. The arguments had died down, replaced by this tense, quiet desperation. We tried hitting the emergency button again, but it was useless. The elevator was completely dead. It's hard to describe how time seems to stretch out when you're stuck like that. Every minute felt like an hour. My stomach was growling, my throat was dry, and I felt lightheaded from the lack of fresh air. No one had any water, and we hadn't eaten since lunch. The thought of spending the night in that elevator was starting to seem like a real possibility, and it was terrifying. The worst part was not knowing what was going on outside. Was the school completely empty now? Were people going home for the weekend, unaware that we were still stuck in there? I kept imagining the janitors locking up, turning off the lights, and leaving us there until Monday morning. It was this sinking feeling of helplessness, like no one knew we existed anymore. At one point, Megan started crying. She tried to hide it at first, but we could all hear her sniffling. I think that's when it really hit us how serious this was. We weren't just dealing with some minor inconvenience anymore. We were stuck, and there was no way out. I remember Jason trying to calm her down, but it wasn't working. We were all too far gone at that point, too panicked and frustrated. I felt like I was on the verge of losing it too. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't catch my breath. The walls of the elevator felt like they were closing in, like the air was getting thinner with every passing minute. Then, out of nowhere, the elevator jolted again. It wasn't a big movement, but it was enough to make us all freeze. We waited holding our breath, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it would start moving. But it didn't. It just sat there, dead and motionless, like it had been taunting us. At that point, we'd been stuck for what felt like hours. I don't know how much time had passed, but it must have been at least a couple of hours. The daylight outside was fading, and the school was probably completely empty by now. No one was coming. That realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I don't know what triggered it, but Eric suddenly started banging on the door, yelling at the top of his lungs. He was hitting the metal with his fists, screaming for someone to help us, but it was useless. There was no one left in the building to hear him. I could see the panic in his eyes, the same panic I was feeling. We were all thinking the same thing. What if no one finds us until Monday? We started talking about trying to pry the doors open. I don't know if any of us really thought it would work, but we were desperate. Eric and Jason tried to wedge their fingers into the crack between the doors and pull them apart, but it was useless. The doors wouldn't budge. It was like we were sealed inside this metal coffin. The panic was setting in for all of us now. We were pacing around the small space, trying to stay calm, but it wasn't working. The heat, the stale air, the claustrophobia. It was all too much. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath coming in short gasps. I was starting to feel lightheaded, like I was going to pass out. And then, just when we thought we couldn't take it anymore, the elevator jolted again. This time it was different. The lights flickered, and the elevator started moving. It was slow at first, creaking and groaning like it was struggling to come back to life. But it was moving. We all stood there, frozen, not daring to believe it was actually happening. The elevator crawled down to the first floor, and the doors finally opened with a soft ding. We all rushed out, stumbling into the empty hallway. The school was dark and silent, the only light coming from the emergency exit signs. It was eerie, but we didn't care. We were just relieved to be out of that metal box. We didn't stick around. We grabbed our stuff and bolted for the exit, not even bothering to lock up our lockers or say goodbye to each other. We just wanted to get out of there. When I got home, I didn't say anything to my parents. I just went to my room and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. I felt exhausted, drained, like I'd just been through something I couldn't quite process yet. This happened a few years ago when I was still in high school. I've never really talked about it, but every now and then it comes back to me, especially late at night. I try not to dwell on it too much, but it's one of those things that just sticks with you no matter how hard you try to push it away. It was spring, and we were on a field trip to the Atlanta History Center. If you've ever been, you know it's a pretty big place with a lot of different exhibits, gardens, and historical homes. It's one of those places schools take you when they want you to learn something, but also keep you entertained so you don't get bored and zone out. I wasn't particularly excited about it. Field trips were fine, but this one felt like just another way to kill time. I went along because, well, it's better than sitting in class, right? We all piled into the buses, probably around 50 or 60 of us, and headed downtown. It wasn't a long drive, maybe 20 minutes, and before we knew it, we were there. The day started off pretty normal. We split up into groups, and each group had a chaperone, usually a teacher or a parent volunteer, who was supposed to keep track of us. The place was huge, and they didn't want anyone wandering off. There were a lot of different exhibits, from Civil War stuff to old Atlanta memorabilia, and I remember we went through a couple of them before lunch. It was pretty standard, just walking around, listening to the guide explain things. It was interesting, but nothing that really grabbed my attention. After lunch, they gave us some free time to explore the outdoor areas. There were these gardens and a big historic farmhouse off to the side of the main museum building. That's where things started to feel a little different. I remember a few of my friends were more excited about getting outside than looking at artifacts, so we decided to check out the farmhouse. The place wasn't anything special from the outside, just a typical old southern house with a wraparound porch and some outbuildings nearby. The tour guide had said it was one of those preserved homes from the 1800s, and they'd kept it mostly as it was back in the day. We weren't allowed inside unless we were with a tour group, so we hung out in the yard for a while, just talking and messing around. There were a few other groups of students wandering around, but eventually they all headed back toward the main museum for the next part of the day. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I remember there being fewer and fewer people around as the afternoon went on. It was quiet, except for the occasional distant sound of the other groups laughing or talking as they made their way back. At some point I noticed I hadn't seen one of my friends, Tom, in a while. He wasn't part of the main group I was with, but he'd been around earlier. I figured he was probably off exploring on his own or maybe talking to someone else, so I didn't think much of it at first. We had about 20 minutes before we needed to meet up with the rest of the group, so I figured he'd show up eventually. When the time came to head back to the main building, though, Tom still hadn't shown up. I looked around for him, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The rest of the group was gathering, and I started to get a little worried. I asked a few of my friends if they'd seen him, but no one had. I figured maybe he was already back at the museum. So we headed there, thinking he'd probably just gotten bored and left early. When we got back, though, he wasn't there. The teachers were doing a head count, making sure everyone was accounted for. And that's when it became clear that Tom was missing. His name was called a few times, but no one answered. People started looking around, asking if anyone had seen him, but it seemed like no one had since lunchtime. It was strange because he wasn't the type to just wander off or get lost. He was usually the guy who stuck close to the group, never really wanting to miss out on anything. One of the teachers went to the front desk to ask if anyone had seen him. And that's when things started to get more serious. They couldn't find him anywhere. The staff hadn't seen him since we arrived, and none of the other groups had spotted him either. People were starting to get a little panicked at this point. The idea that someone could just disappear at a place like the Atlanta History Center seemed ridiculous. But there we were, standing in the lobby, waiting for something to happen. I remember standing with a few of my friends, trying to figure out what was going on. The teachers were huddled together, talking quietly, and one of them was on the phone with someone, probably the police. They didn't want to make a big scene in front of the rest of us, but it was obvious they were freaked out. After what felt like forever, they told us to sit tight while they searched the grounds. They didn't want us going anywhere, so we all stayed in the lobby, waiting. A couple of the staff members went out with the teachers to look for Tom, but I had this sinking feeling that something wasn't right. It didn't make sense that he'd just wander off like that, especially with how strict the teachers were about staying with the group. We waited for what must have been an hour, maybe more, but they didn't find him. The police arrived at some point and started combing through the property, but there was still no sign of him. They brought in a couple of dogs to search the woods behind the farmhouse, but even that didn't turn up anything. It was like Tom had just vanished into thin air. They didn't tell us much after that. The rest of the day was a blur. Eventually, they loaded us back onto the buses and sent us home. The whole ride back, everyone was quiet, which was weird for a group of high schoolers. We were all just sitting there, trying to wrap our heads around what had happened. The teachers didn't say much either, just that they were doing everything they could to find Tom, and that we should all try to stay calm. When we got back to school, our parents were waiting for us. It was clear that the news had spread quickly and everyone was on edge. I went home that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about Tom. I kept replaying the day in my head, trying to figure out where he could have gone. Had I seen him after lunch? Did he say anything about going somewhere? It all just felt so unreal. The next day at school, the mood was completely different. No one was talking about anything else. Tom still hadn't been found, and the police were now treating it like a missing person case. They interviewed a bunch of students, trying to piece together where he'd last been seen, but no one had any useful information. I gave them my account of the day, but it didn't help much. I hadn't seen him since lunchtime, just like everyone else. The days started to blur together after that. Every morning we'd come to school hoping for news, but there was never any. The police kept searching, but it seemed like they were getting nowhere. Tom's family came to the school a few times, talking to the teachers and students, trying to find answers, but no one had any. It was like he'd just disappeared without a trace. I started thinking about that farmhouse more and more. Something about it didn't sit right with me. We'd all been hanging out there that day, and Tom had been there too. What if he'd gone inside? It wasn't allowed, but there were no staff members watching the place. It would have been easy to slip in without anyone noticing. I kept thinking about that big, empty house. The way it seemed so quiet and isolated, even with all the people around. A week later, we found out that Tom had been found. He was alive, but barely. They found him in a small locked storage room inside the farmhouse. He was disoriented, dehydrated, and had no idea how long he'd been in there. The door had been locked from the outside, and there were no windows in the room. He'd been trapped in the dark, alone, for days. Tom didn't remember much about how he got there. He said he'd gone to explore the farmhouse on his own, curious about what was inside. The last thing he remembered was hearing the door creak behind him as he stepped into one of the rooms. After that, everything went black. He didn't know who had locked him in or how long he'd been in there before he was found. The police tried to investigate, but they didn't have much to go on. There were no signs of forced entry, and no one had seen anyone suspicious that day. It was as if someone had locked him in there and then vanished without a trace. Tom never talked about it much after that. He came back to school eventually, but he wasn't the same. He was quieter, more withdrawn, like the whole experience had changed him. We all tried to move on, but it wasn't easy. The idea that something like that could happen on a school trip in the middle of the day with so many people around, it just didn't make sense.